Okay, so in this podcast here, we're going to have a look at this concept of consumption from a Keynesian point of view, and we're going to dissect the consumption function. But before we do that, we need to understand that consumption isn't anything new. We've actually seen this concept of consumption before when we looked at the circular flow of income. And if we actually have a look at our two-sector model, which consists of the production sector and the household sector, then what we find is that the household sector receives income, that's the flow of money from producers to households, and in return, we can then use that income on consumption. So when we look at consumption from a Keynesian perspective, we're going to see that the great majority of consumption actually is dependent on this concept of income, which we denote by Y. And also important thing to know before we get started is that consumption is actually the largest component of aggregate expenditure. And this includes things like consumption itself, investment, government spending, as well as net exports. That's exports minus imports. So this concept of consumption is really, really important because it does make up the largest component of spending or aggregate expenditure in our economy. So Keynes comes along and puts this consumption function together. So we can start with this value A. Now, A refers to what we call autonomous expenditure. Autonomous expenditure, okay. And I always like to think of autonomous expenditure, sorry, it looks a bit messy there, as what we need to spend even when our income is equal to zero. So whether it's an individual, whether we take it on the perspective of an economy altogether, what do we need to spend when our income is zero? So I think to myself, even if I lose my job today, I'll still need to pay for things such as rent, to satisfy my need for shelter. I'll still need to pay for things like food to satisfy my hunger, etc., etc. So autonomous expenditure makes up some of our nation's consumption, and these are the things we need to purchase even when our income is equal to zero. Now, if we move on, we have this B value here. Now, this B value here is short for something known as the marginal propensity to consume. And we're going to refer to this as the MPC, just to make things a bit quicker. So that's that B value. Now, the marginal propensity to consume is this concept that as we have a change in our income, our spending's also likely to change. So we can represent this in a formula where the MPC is equal to the change in consumption over the change in income. So if you ever see this little triangle, this little delta sign, then this means change in. Okay, so just lock that one away because you will see that little triangle every now and then. So let's say I'm in a situation where this week I get a $500 bonus. Thank you very much. Now that I've got that extra $500 in my pocket, I'm going to think to myself, you know what? I'm going to start splashing out on goods and services I wouldn't usually buy, and I'm going to increase my consumption expenditure by $250. This gives me a marginal propensity to consume of 0.5 if you just plug that into your calculator. Now, I can then interpret this a separate way, this 0.5, to mean that for every additional $1 of income, I will then increase my spending by 50 cents. Okay, that's another little way of interpreting this MPC of 0.5. But what we've just found is that our consumption is changing based on our income. So if we actually take BY and group that together, what we can call this is our induced expenditure. Induced expenditure, which is the opposite of the autonomous expenditure. And the induced expenditure is this idea that as we have a change in income, consumption will change as well, or more accurately, induced expenditure is spending dependent on income, as opposed to autonomous expenditure, which was independent of income. And we can see that represented here in this algebraic formula. One last thing, and I might just make a quick step back, so I forgot to mention this, but the MPC of 0.5 is interesting because the MPC will either result in a number between 0 and 1. If you get 0 as your MPC, it means with every change in income that you don't actually change your consumption, you're not spending any of that additional income. And if your MPC is equal to 1, well, that means you're spending 100% of that change in income on additional consumption. So when we look at consumption from now on, there's two components: the autonomous expenditure when income's equal to 0, things you have to spend just to survive, and the induced expenditure where income is dependent on, consumption is dependent on a change in income. And there is our consumption function.